All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session. I'm Rob Podlasek. I'm the training director for Literacy Minnesota, and I'm joined with Andrea Echelberger, who is the ESL training coordinator. But for this, we'll just call her the big brain because that's her function for a lot of projects, including this. And we're very excited to see people here to learn about the updated training standards for Minnesota and then the updated procedures to meet those training standards. Just curious, how many people here started their connection with ABE as a volunteer? So if you want to go ahead in the chat box and share out if you started your connection in ABE as a volunteer. I did. Who else? Astrid. Andrea. I think most of the state staff did, which is pretty exciting. Kylie, Jody did. Patsy as well. All right, so that's cool that so many people got involved in the field through the role as a volunteer. So that's pretty exciting. I'm gonna go next slide, Andrea. So our presentation today breaks into two parts. The first part, we'll be talking about the state's updated volunteer training standards. So I'll go over those. And then Andrea will talk about Literacy Minnesota Foundations training, which is how Literacy Minnesota is going to help the field meet the training standards going forward. We'll take a break for questions after my part about the standards, and then we'll take a break at the end for questions after talking about the training modules. And please feel free to chat out questions as you have them, and we'll get to them eventually. Go to the next slide. So on October 1st, 2021, we will have updated volunteer training standards in Minnesota, and we will focus on those today. But I wanted to do a little bit of history of the training standards in Minnesota. And so we'll start out with the olden days. And I was looking for recorded webinars from 1972, couldn't find any. So some of this history has been lost, but way back in the day, leadership at Minnesota Department of Education really made a commitment to the use of volunteers in Minnesota ABE and the support of volunteers in Minnesota ABE. And that support has continued to this day. And I really kind of think we take it for granted here in Minnesota. And certainly when I've done trainings for other parts of the country, I realize that the other ABE systems aren't quite as encouraging in the use of volunteers as Minnesota is. So wanted to thank those early pioneers for setting that foundation of volunteer use in Minnesota, and thank the current Minnesota ABE state staff for continuing the support of volunteers in Minnesota. So volunteers have been part of Minnesota ABE for a long time. And then in early 2000s, it was realized that there's a state statute that says that anybody providing literacy services in adult literacy in Minnesota is required to have. And that not only applies to teachers, but it also applies to volunteers. And so back in the early 2000s, the state staff started putting together the first set of volunteer training standards, looking at what volunteers need to get in terms of training in order to work in Minnesota ABE programs. And those standards chugged along for quite a while with a couple of minor tweaks until COVID hit. And then we are kind of in a conundrum because the way volunteers were being used was different, and the standards didn't reflect that. And access to volunteer training was compromised. And so we had to change things. And so the state staff on May 18th of 2020 suspended the volunteer training standards, saying any volunteers who started would be exempt from those standards. So now things are going back to slightly normal. And so on October 1st, 2021, we will have a reinstated and updated set of training standards in Minnesota. And people ask, what about the volunteers who started on May 19th, 2020? Do they need to be trained or need to meet these standards? And the answer is no, there is a grandfather clause. So if you had a volunteer who started in that gap, the requirement for them to get trained isn't there. And I've also had people say, well, what if the volunteer starts on September 30th? Do they need to be trained? And so before we get into the letter of the law, I'd really like to cover the spirit of the law. So Andrea, if you go next slide. So read it. All volunteers should receive the training and support that they need in order to feel comfortable and to provide effective service to learners. So that really is the spirit of these standards and these requirements. We want volunteers to feel comfortable in their role. Nothing worse to walk into a situation and not know what you're doing. And so the volunteer manager part of me really values that these standards are in place to make volunteers feel comfortable. And then the second part, they're there to provide effective service to learners. That is our ultimate goal. And so we want to make sure that our volunteers have the skills and the knowledge and the attitudes that they need in order to provide that effective service. So again, as you think about these standards, how they apply to your program, remember that the goal is to provide the support for the volunteers so they feel comfortable, and ultimately so they provide that quality service. Next slide. So it's a balancing act, right? We want to make volunteering accessible to people, and having them go through training sometimes gets in the way of that. But we also want to provide that high quality service. So these standards are sort of doing a dance around those two needs: how to invite members of the community into our programs and how to make sure that they provide quality service. All right, go next slide. So I will send out a link to the actual standards, but rather than sending that now and having you click on it and go off and read it, I'll just put stuff on the slides and then I'll send that out in a bit. But basically the volunteer training requirements fit 3 buckets, and which bucket or which set of requirements your volunteers need depends on what they are going to do. So some volunteers will only need a provider-specific orientation and then training specific to their job. Other bucket of volunteers will need that provider-specific orientation and training plus 4 hours of initial training. And then another bucket of volunteers will need that provider-specific orientation and training plus 12 hours. And Brad and Astrid, we should have come up with a PSOT, an acronym for provider-specific orientation and training, because that's a mouthful. Right, Andrea, go next slide, please. So, and we're going to say this is provider-specific orientation and training only volunteers. So these are volunteers who are only expected to go through this level of training. And first are volunteers who are really not providing instructional services. Okay, so they might be doing intake, bookkeeping, they might be tech aides, doing data entry. We have some volunteers who are taking the lessons and turning them into PowerPoints and things like that. So if you have volunteers who are not doing that instruction, they are not required to get more than the provider-specific orientation and training. They are certainly welcome to, they are encouraged to, but they are not required to. And then there are a few acknowledgements of prior background knowledge. So if a volunteer has a teaching license and there's a list of other prerequisites that count, then they are exempt from having to get more training than this. And then what is a provider-specific orientation and training? Things like site procedures, how things work, risk management policies your program has, and then the specific training that they need for the tasks that they'll be doing. So how to do intake, how to do record keeping, how to make bulletin boards, whatever it is you have your volunteers doing. Okay, go to the next slide. So the next bucket of volunteers are volunteers who need that orientation and site-specific training. But then in addition, there is a 4-hour initial training requirement. And this applies to volunteers who are working as a classroom assistant. So they're working under direction of either an adult education teacher or a volunteer who has met the 12-hour training requirement, which we'll talk about in a second. Another category are volunteers who are working with subgroups. So if you break your class up into groups and have a group go in the next room, volunteer working with that group will need the 4-hour initial training. Volunteers for providing supplemental instruction outside. So if you have a conversation class and then on the next day, learners are meeting via Zoom for conversation practice, those volunteers would fit into the 4-hour initial training requirement. And then if your volunteers are working as navigators, so digital literacy navigators, career navigators, social service navigators, or whatever, they fit into the 4-hour initial training requirement bucket. And what does that 4-hour training look like? Broken into 2 parts. First part is 2 hours of content revolving around understanding adult learners. And a little bit later, Andrea will get into some of those specifics. And then the remaining 2 hours are specific targeted training based on the needs of your volunteers. So if they're going to be a writing volunteer, taking writing training would be great. If they're going to be a GED volunteer, taking GED training would be great. So what those extra 2 hours are up to the choice of the program and the volunteer. All right, next slide. And then the third bucket are volunteers who need that provider-specific orientation and training, and then 12 hours of training on top of that. And these are volunteers who are delivering instruction or are under minimal or no direction of a teacher, okay? These are volunteers, and those are volunteers might be working one-on-one. And then there are volunteers who are doing group instruction, classroom instruction, again, under minimal or no direct supervision of a teacher. So the question of, are they working under the direction of a teacher? Okay. And then are they using materials, lesson plans that have been created by the teacher? That is a big distinction between the 4-hour requirement and the 12-hour requirement. And then in terms of the content, you can see it broken down. Okay. Oops, I did my math wrong there. I did my math wrong, sorry. There's 2 hours for overview of Minnesota adult education, 2 hours for understanding adult learners, 2 hours instructional best practices dealing with how to work with adult learners, 2 hours of how to deal with materials, like how to do lesson planning and so forth. And then targeted training based on needs should be 4 hours. So that's where they can go to the math training or the pronunciation training or the writing training. All right. So those are the 3 buckets. And then for all of the volunteers, there's a requirement that for ongoing training. So after they have done 1 year of tutoring, we ask that they go through 2 hours of ongoing training per year. Okay? And this actually came up, this was part of the original standards, and it came out of a group of teachers and volunteer coordinators who asked for a sort of a stick, I guess, to encourage their longer term volunteers to get ongoing training. And obviously in Minnesota adult basic education, we very much value ongoing PD. That's where we're at this conference. And so this is just to encourage volunteers to keep up with their skills. And this can be a formal in-service or workshop provided by Literacy Minnesota. It could be a formal workshop provided by the local program. It could be an informal get-together brown bag idea sharing. So it really is up to the program to decide what constitutes those 2 hours. Okay, and then one more click. Okay. And I wanted to go back to this. Again, the spirit of these rules. All volunteers should receive the training and support that they need in order to feel comfortable and provide effective service to learners. So it really boils down to those 2 things. And so as you think about how these requirements play out in your program, again, try to think what is going to help the volunteers be successful, and then ultimately what is going to help the learners be successful. And one more click. I'm going to put in the chat a link to the policies. So this will take you to the policies page, directly to the policies page. And down here at the bottom is the volunteer training standards policy. And if you click on that, you'll get a printout of a PDF of all of the standards. Okay. All right, go ahead and click to the question slide, and here's a great place for you to chat out your questions. See if anyone's still awake out there. There's a question from Mark. Just to clarify, the 12 hours to provide instruction, are these sessions, hours, workshops available in recorded webinar format? That is a beautiful segue to what Andrea will be talking about. So I will hold off on that one until she has the floor. What would you say the best training would be to encourage long-term volunteers to take? I think it varies on that volunteer. In some cases, it might be learning more about a specific topic. With other volunteers, it might be a reminder of working with adult learners. So I would say, I don't know if there's necessarily a best one. I think I would work together with a volunteer to figure out what is best. And another good segue, where are the trainings held? Online. Okay. So I think since we got how's this going to work in terms of training, do volunteers who stopped out under COVID now fall under this new training policy? They would fall under the old training policy, the one from 2006. So that is slightly different. And so any volunteer who started before the pandemic would fall under the previous policy. All right. Well, Literacy Minnesota, as a support services provider, it's our job to help the field meet these requirements. And so Andrea is going to share our plans for doing that.
Hey, thanks, Rob. And if people have any questions, again, we'll pause at the end of my section for questions. And then also feel free, I have the chat box open. Rob has the chat box open, so we can be addressing questions as they come up. And actually, as soon as you handed it over to me, Rob, I see 3 more questions came up. So why don't you go ahead and address them before I jump into the nuts and bolts of how this training will be delivered?
Okay. The big difference between the old policy and the new policy is that in the old policy, classroom volunteers were not required to go through any training. And so they wouldn't have that 4-hour of training requirement. So that's the big difference. Yeah, so that would be the one I would pull out. If you have specific questions, ask. And a lot of these things are, ask about specific scenarios because that makes it easier. And then
I see somebody looking to see if there's a way to access the 2006 policies through the ABE website. And then another, how do I find previous old policies from volunteers who started before the pandemic?
Aster, are those policies still on the site?
No, we've pulled them off the site.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not, we could maybe connect with people looking for the old policies. I think at this point, moving forward, it's the new policy that's the one that is relevant.
Sure. Again, if you have specific questions, please reach out and talk to me. I can help you sort through. And let's see. So any volunteer teaching a supplemental small group would fall under the 4-hour training, and anyone teaching a core class would fall under the 12-hour training, correct? I think if it's supplemental, you mean the classroom teachers teaching the content and then they're doing a lesson where they're reviewing the content, then they would require the 4-hour training. If they are leading that session and they're creating the materials, then they would fall under the 12-hour requirement.
And one of the things I'm gonna show you is where on our Literacy Minnesota's website, you will be able to find this tool that we're talking about in a place where you can just at a glance see which, depending on the role of the volunteer, be able to see what they'll be expected to complete for training. All right, so I'm going to jump into talking about the Volunteer Foundations training. And we really wanted to highlight that when we were working on the model of how this was going to be delivered, we had 3 priorities in mind. And the first one was accessibility. And this was huge because we wanted accessibility to be able to work with volunteers' schedules, volunteers who might not be able to come in and do in-person training, which was primarily our mode of delivery prior to the pandemic. And we also really wanted to make sure that it was accessible to programs in greater Minnesota who want to be utilizing volunteers and to get them trained. Also one of our priorities was flexibility. So flexibility within the parameters of the standards, and then flexibility with people's schedules. Knowing that we have volunteers, people might be working full-time, might be doing full-time family, working with their family, might not have a lot of time again to come into an in-person training. So how could we make sure that people could access the training that they need in a flexible way that works with their lives? And then the final part is relevance. We want this to be useful. We want this to be something that's going to be, as Rob said, helpful so that when volunteers get started, they feel confident, they have, a strong foundation for being able to do tutoring, to do teaching, and also wanted to make sure that they were getting trained in the specific areas that they were going to be working on and trained on the skills that they want. And along with all of this, we really wanted to make sure that we were acknowledging the diversity in programming. So looking at, we have across Minnesota, Rob, this was one of our trivia questions last night. How many consortiums are there in Minnesota? Do you remember?
I forgot. I do forgot. But I remember the oldest elephant, so that I remembered.
There are a lot of consortiums in Minnesota, which means that there is, from Julie, 39, and Jody. Thank you, state staff. But there are a lot of different programs. Programs look really different and have different needs when it comes to volunteer training and what exactly the roles volunteers will be taking on. So we wanted to make a training that was accessible, flexible, but was also going to be relevant for a volunteer no matter what role that they took on. So one thing that we are going to be asking for as we're rolling this out on October 1st, and we are currently in the process of building the plane as we're flying it. So we've managed to get everything pulled together to be able to present and talk to you about it today. Like, there's been a ton of hard work that's gone in between the Minnesota Department of Education and Literacy Minnesota to roll this out. And we're in the process of developing those modules that will become available. We'll be doing our pilot session in September. So that analogy of building the plane while flying it, we are doing that, and we are really open to getting feedback for how we can make this, again, more accessible, more flexible, and as relevant as possible to your programs. So Rob talked about the two different options that we have, which are the 12-hour and the 4-hour. So I'm going to briefly mention them again, and then I'm going to show you where you can find a resource where you can see volunteer roles listed out and which training people would need. So we have, the first one is our Foundations of Adult Education Tutoring, and that's going to be the 12-hour training. And as Rob said, it's designed for teachers who are teaching independently of a professional teacher. It consists of 4 core training modules and then 2 targeted training modules. And I'll unpack those and pull those apart in just a few slides. So that's our first option, the more extensive option. And this is modeled after and mirrors what was in place previously to the pandemic. Our second option is the Foundations of Volunteering in the Adult Education Classroom. And this is that 4-hour option, which is designed for volunteers who are working under the supervision of a professional teacher. And that consists of 2 parts. It consists of core training module 2, working with adult learners, and then just 1 targeted training module. So, and I've seen a lot of questions coming in the chat about, well, how do I know which training people are going to need? So I wanted to show you this resource that we have. And this is going to be, I'm going to show you our page on the website as well. And this is going to be available for people to take a look at. But we have the 12 hours and the 4 hours, and we have the different roles, and you can see who needs what, the 12 hours versus the four hours. So this is a place where you can just kind of come, think about the role, look at it at a glance and know what training they're going to get. And then down at the bottom, we have it broken out by exactly which module, core module versus target module for those different roles. Yep, and as Rob said in the chat, if you have roles that you haven't thought of that are specific to your program, please let us know. You can let us know in the chat, or you can always send either Rob or I an email or a message afterwards, and we will make sure that that is added to this. This is obviously a living document that is going to be in progress, and we will be adding to it as we go, as people come up with all of the brilliant ways that programs out there are using volunteers to fill in the gaps and help support learners. All right, so I'm going to just pause 1 second so people can take a look at the different roles that we have: the classroom teacher, classroom co-teacher, and then one-on-one tutor. And those are, again, the 3 that are doing that independent teaching. And then we have all the roles listed out for more of the classroom assistants, the volunteers who are going to be working under the direct supervision of a teacher. And yeah, this is a Google Doc, and again, the link to the Google Doc is going to be able to be found on the website, Literacy Minnesota website page that I'll be showing in just a few minutes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and shift back to the slides. But again, if there is something that we're missing, please share it in the chat, or please contact us afterwards and let us know, and we will make sure that we get that in there. All right. So we have a tool so that you can see which direction will volunteers need to take. And again, that direction is going to be dependent upon the role that they have as a volunteer in your program. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what do we mean when we're talking about our core training modules versus the targeted training modules. So the core training modules, these are 4 modules that have the content that any volunteer who's going to be teaching independently is going to be expected to have experience with. So module 1 is going to be doing that overview of Minnesota adult education and program accountability. That's going to include things like demographics of learners, the content standards, assessment, NRS educational levels, completion levels, other state accountability information, and really digging into who are in our classes, who are going to be the learners. Module 2, and as you remember, module 2 is the module that is required for the 4-hour training. This is understanding adult learners, and so that's digging into characteristics, motivation, and teaching principles of adult learners. So what do we talk about? What are some of kind of those foundational backbones that we want people to know when they go in to teach adults? Since for a lot of people, maybe they've had experience, working as children, or the last time that they've been involved in education, they were children themselves or college students. And how does that look different when we're talking about adult education? We'll also be touching on equity and cultural awareness, and then making sure that we're doing some empathy building with sensitivity to the challenges of learning English and or developing literacy skills. Then modules 3 and 4 are digging into the actual best practices. So the third one, module 3, is going to be talking about working with students, you know, how to do explicit instruction, checking comprehension, error correction and feedback, asking facilitating questions and learner-centered instruction. And then module 4, instructional best practices working with materials, is going to look at how do you work with the materials that your program gives you. So that's going to be things like scaffolding, gradual release of responsibility, talking about a little bit about lesson planning. So those are the core training modules. Again, somebody who's doing the 12-hour training would take all 4 of those modules. Somebody doing the 4-hour training would just take module 2. Then we have our targeted training modules, which are the modules that are the choose your own adventure, is how I keep referring to them. So that would be modules, the targeted training modules are ones that the volunteers can independently, or they can work with the coordinator or supervising teacher. And they're going to can select based on the level. So whether they're working with literacy level, beginning level English, up through GED. They can also, as Rob mentioned, dig into a specific skill. If they're going to be doing tutoring in writing, they can take a training in writing. If they're going to be working with citizenship, they can take training on citizenship, reading, pronunciation, math. So this is where we honestly, it was challenging with how we delivered it before the pandemic, in that everybody would come to the same 12-hour training and then they'd go off to where they were going to volunteer and maybe say, ooh, I'm working with literacy level learners and I actually didn't get any like direct instruction on how to do this. So this is where we're trying to really build up that relevance, that once volunteers know where they're going to be placed, they can choose those targeted trainings based on what they want to learn. And one of the options will be, if you have volunteers who are training remotely, we will continue to have options, the options that we've had throughout the pandemic, for people to be able to take training specifically on how do you do remote tutoring and remote instruction. All right. So how are people going to be able to access the training modules? So again, this is going to be, previously it was, here is the 12-hour training. You take it in person, you take it kind of at the same time in a chunk, and that is your option. And now we're going to switch it up so that people can kind of mix and match. So this is getting to that accessibility and flexibility. We'll continue to offer live webinars. So every month we'll offer the core training modules twice, one available during the day and one available during the evening. We'll also be offering live targeted training webinars, at least one a week, possibly more. We're still navigating that schedule. But then the other option we'll have is that people will be able to view video recordings, and then they'll review a video and then they will complete and submit a video training reflection form in order to get credit for watching the video and participating in that. It's a video training. It's not just watching other people go through it. It is, there will be pauses, and I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. So we can dig into that a little bit more because that's a little more challenging. But then the last option, and this is going to start in 2022, is we'll start to have those in-person trainings available again for the core modules and then some of the targeted trainings. So somebody might come to module 1 and 2 as live webinars, and then something happens, they go out of town, their work schedule changes, so they're going to watch module 3 and 4 as recordings, and then they're going to take a targeted training module as a recording and a targeted training module as a live webinar. So all of these different options, again, to just try to make it as accessible as possible and have that flexibility so people can get the training that they need in a timely manner, the time they want. So I wanted to quickly unpack the video training modules. And just because this is something that's a little bit different, although some programs we have a few up, and I know some programs have been very successfully using the options that we currently have. We're going to be adding to more. So the process is that volunteers are going to register for the training on the Literacy Minnesota's volunteer training calendar, and it's under the video trainings tab. And I will just quickly show you what that looks like. So when you go to the calendar, there's the in-person webinar trainings in one option. There's video trainings is the other option. So here, that video trainings is where people will access those those recorded trainings. After they register, they'll be sent an email with the link to the video and then access to the web page with slides and the video training reflection form. So somebody has to register in order to get access to the materials, which allows us to track them and track their progress through our database. And then once volunteers complete the video training and they do their reflection form, then that is emailed to Literacy Minnesota, and they are marked down as having attended the training. So again, this is a way for us to track that people are watching the videos, and then they have to actively participate and complete this the video training reflection form. So as I was saying before, it's not just a recording of a webinar like what we're making today. What it is it's the training with pauses built in throughout, where whoever is doing the recording will say, all right, now it's time to turn off your camera, turn to section 3 of your video reflection form, and please reflect on the scenarios that you see there, write down your responses, and then come back and keep going. So we check everyone that comes in, we look and make sure that they have completed it, and people are doing some really great work with that. Okay, and I see a question from Tammy, and I have a slide for that. So hold on to that question. I have a slide for it, and then if you have any specific questions, we can dig in. So then a question is, how do volunteers know which targeted training modules that they want to take? So we have a page in our website. This page in our website has all of the information you need. It has not had an opportunity to be looked at our fabulous web designer. So it is going to get prettier. However, it currently has everything that you should need to know. And what I want to draw people's attention to is down here towards the bottom, where we have our core training module descriptions. So people can see all those descriptions. But then we have the targeted training module descriptions. So this is where somebody who started volunteering is like, oh, I'm working with literacy level learners. I'm not quite sure where to start. They can click on this and they can see the different options for modules, those targeted training modules that they can take that are specific to that level. Again, for beginning level English, intermediate advanced English, GED, also then based on topic, so citizenship, conversation, these are the recommendations that we have right now. Reading and writing, these are the different options. Remote instruction, these are the different options. So a place that volunteers can go and look and see what are the options of targeted trainings they can take. And also where program coordinators and teachers who are working with volunteers can go to look to see, oh, I'm gonna have you doing some writing work, or I'm gonna have you do some listening and speaking work. Here is what I would recommend that what I'd recommend that you go ahead and take. All right. And I see some questions are coming in. I'm going to get through the last slide, and then we have our section for questions. And so that was, and a question that came in is that proof of attendance. and proof of completion of training. So yes, we will still have a certificate that will be issued for people who complete the 12-hour training, just like we did before in person. So for each module that's completed, people will be sent CEUs, which will be a way for volunteers to track how much they've taken, what they've taken. And then after someone finishes the 12 hours, we'll be every week or so going through and running a report. And anyone who has met the requirements for that 12-hour Foundations of Adult Education tutoring will be sent a certificate that they can keep, hold on to, and also forward and submit to the program they're working with. For the Foundations of Volunteering in the Adult Education Classroom, this is that 4-hour one. For this, we're not going to be issuing a specific certificate, but what we will be doing is people will be getting those continuing education units, which will be a way for people to show, because they can forward them, print them off, submit them to show that they've taken that second module, number 2, and then one targeted training module. All right, so we have 5 minutes left and we are going to go through questions. And so Rob, I know you've been watching the chat. I've been talking a lot. I know you've been watching the chat. So what are some of those questions that you would like to address? And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to pop them in now.
I think I have answered them in the chat. Ruthers has a new one. How do I find the core training module description on the website?
All right, so if you go to core training modules number 1 through 4, and let me go ahead and pop this into the chat so everybody will have it. There we go. Here, that first section, core training module descriptions, if you click on that drop-down menu, you'll be able to see the descriptions for 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right.
Manfred, are you thinking volunteer evaluation in terms of volunteers evaluating the training process, or of us evaluating the volunteers?
Yeah, so we currently don't have an assessment for volunteers. The idea is that as people take the training and that 12-hour training, as they go through the modules, either independently or through the live webinars, they're going to be getting some of that coaching and support that they need to be able to be successful. So we don't at the end then do an assessment of volunteers. However, do want to let people know that when people attend live webinars, that is something that trainers are looking out for. If there are any glaring red flags, that we immediately let Mariah know who does the placement, or we let programs know if we have any hesitation or concerns about somebody who goes through the training. So it's not a formal process, but it is something that we watch out for, and definitely an advantage to encourage people, new volunteers, to go through those live webinars.
Other questions people have?
All right, Rob, I'm going to punt this one to you. Continue to offer the Foundations in Distance Education certificate.
Well, we thought we were kind of done with that, but apparently we're not, given the state of lockdowns and masks and so forth. We will have it available in recorded webinar. All of those sessions are recorded. So even if we don't offer them live, because there's only so much of Andrea to go around for these trainings, people would still be able to watch the recorded webinars and get that certificate. But we'll be monitoring how important that is going forward, and that will depend upon how much programs are using volunteers remotely. I think that's going to be the one big thing we need to watch for all of us in the next year. What's the future of remote instruction?
And I see from Manfred, a tool for teachers and programs, how to volunteer, evaluate and help volunteers who may not work out, to coach someone out.
Got Mariah here. That's a good thing for her to-do list.
And the completion, yeah, so I see a question from Roz, with the completion of the 4 core training modules plus 4 hours of their choice be the best options for new volunteers needing a 12-hour option. Yeah, that is exactly what volunteers would do. Those 4 core training modules meet the standards and are what people, what people need in order to have a successful experience. We have 1 more minute. Any last questions?
And as Andrea said, this is last year has been a big reset for everything, including tutor training. We're really excited that people are taking advantage of webinars, and with being able to offer webinars is one way to make this flexibility possible. But we're excited to see how it's going to play out in the future. So
Yeah.
Let us know your input, your feedback, your suggestions.
So I see a question from Tammy. If volunteers do not complete the 2-hour yearly training, will we be able to continue logging their hours?
According to the policy, no. So you would need to ask them to complete that requirement. And again, the idea is, it's a good idea to get ongoing training.
And this is, again, one of the things we're trying to do is just make it as accessible and easy as possible. So if someone's like, well, I work and I can't make it into any of the live webinars. Great. Here's the record where you can find those video trainings. Do it on your own time. Do it at 3 a.m. in the morning. And people can get that requirement met easily. And it's been so exciting doing live webinars and having people logging in from all over the state of Minnesota, not just from St. Paul and Minneapolis, but there's people joining from everywhere around Minnesota. And it's been absolutely delightful to be able to get a chance to start meeting teachers and volunteers who are doing fantastic work in consortium out in greater Minnesota. All right.
I think we are done. Thank you, everybody.
And thanks to Patsy and Merrick for your support on this.
Yeah, I'll stop the recording. If there are any lingering questions, do